Hello there. Welcome to this MOOC Hangout. My name is Tim Dahl. I'm a researcher at the Resilience Centre.
And I'm Jamila Haider. I'm a postdoc, also here at the Stockholm Resilience Centre.
So we're here to try to answer your questions and just talk a little bit more about our experiences and some of the research that we shared with you in the lectures. And we have our colleagues here monitoring your questions and feeding them through to us. So we'd really love to hear from you. So don't be shy. Send us in some questions and we will try and make for an interesting conversation.
Yeah, indeed. Yeah, and I guess while we wait for some questions to come through, there's been a few that have come up already. And I guess as one thing that Tim and I have both worked quite a lot extensively in different parts of the world, him in East Africa, and I've worked a lot in Central Asia. And I guess one of the things that is interesting and maybe has come up within the lectures are these different approaches of conceptualizing human-environment relationships. And so we thought we'd maybe just kick off by having a few reflections on those different approaches. Yeah, so I guess did you want to start with ecosystem services?
Yeah, well, I mean, I spoke quite a lot about ecosystem services, and a lot of our work has been used the ecosystem services concept as a starting point. It's gained increasingly a lot of currency in different policy circles. It's often been interpreted in quite a economic sense, and the application of ecosystem services has often been about deciding the economic value of the services that we get, the goods and services that we get from ecosystems. So economic valuation approaches. And we actually have not really engaged so much in that in this course content and in our research as well, because we find that a sort of aggregate economic analysis of the value of an ecosystem maybe doesn't tell you so much about different individuals and how they benefit from well-being. A lot of our work has been involved in trying to explore how those benefits are distributed unevenly, and if you don't understand that distribution, if you just take an overall average benefit, then you're going to really miss an important part of the story, especially if you're talking about development and poverty. And another thing is the kind of multidimensionality of the problem, trying to reduce everything down to an economic number, really, can create a very partial understanding. And Jamila, a lot of your work has been about exploring how can you look beyond that economic dimension, which has dominated a lot of the thinking around ecosystems and development.
Yeah, and I guess that's one of the things that we've found really interesting is it also kind of the degree of complexity that one engages with will also depend a bit on context. So speaking a bit to what Tim was just saying, a lot of the dominant ways that we think about poverty, even though we know poverty is multidimensional and that's been well established for decades, we often still reduce poverty to a single economic metric because that's what's easy to measure. So that's why in some of this conceptual modeling work, we brought in culture and nature as very simplified ways to bring in multidimensionality using the economic equations themselves. And that's, I guess, one thing as a researcher, that's to speak to one particular audience, which in this case was people who are using these types of models for development projects, for example. Whereas on the flip side of some of the work that I've done is this much more grassroots or place-based research where talking about things in capitals and boxes doesn't work at all. So that's where I, as a researcher, have completely switched my own approach to use language and use daily words that make sense in any given place. And one of the questions that we see came up before from one of you was asking an idea for help in building a project for people co-evolving with species or in a particular place. And so I guess that would be as a very general reflection on some of the research that I've done, is just being aware of those co-evolving relationships. So rather than treating things as this is now like a nature intervention, or this is an economic intervention, or this is a cultural intervention, because that's what often happens within development projects, is they become sectoral, but actually appreciating that these things, as we all know, are very interlinked. And I guess that's whether it's through an ecosystem services framework or a biocultural framing, or this broader social ecological framing, it's to acknowledge and accept that these, or to celebrate really that these are interlinkages that exist. So rather than breaking them apart and then pulling them back together, we need frameworks in order to understand social and ecological as one thing.
And that really speaks to these sort of ideas of intertwinedness or coevolution, that you can see that any given intervention, it has these kind of knock-on changes. So an example from some simple fisheries examples, an intervention which is designed to increase the earning capacity of fishermen or of a particular group. I can give you an example from East Africa, where there's an intervention to support women octopus harvesters with access to international markets. And that, as a straightforward intervention in a non-complex system, would be, okay, you change this particular part of the system, you increase market access for that group, and that group's income is going to increase, and that's going to empower the women within that system. But of course, the system itself adjusts. So in terms of the ecological system, there was a response to that higher fishing effort, which led to some overexploitation in some of the areas of the fishery, but also there was a social response in that changed the status of octopus fishing and actually made it more attractive to men to move into that fishery and actually compete with the women. So what you might think is a simple cause-effect type of intervention, actually you can see, because this is a complex system and the social and ecological systems are interconnected, the second and third round results of that intervention ended up being quite negative in some ways for the target group.
Yeah, which speaks also to this broader complex adaptive systems approach that I think comes up in quite a few of the lectures in the module, and also actually some of the questions that have come through. So that was a perfect example of how a complex adaptive systems perspective helps us frame well in I guess three ways: that unpredictability, that things can be contagious, so that one effect will lead on to other effects that are not linear, are not cause and effect simple relationships, but also that complex adaptive systems demonstrate this modularity and also redundancy. And I think that was some of the questions coming in as well. What does this modularity actually, what does it mean? And I don't know if we can try to think through.
Maybe we can delve into that a little bit.
The octopus example, for example, but maybe there's a better one. But I guess, yeah, I often think of it as that many parts of the system are more connected within rather than with other, within the system as opposed to outside of the system. And that this type of network creates, can create resilience or not resilience, I guess, in other situations. But I think, maybe, I don't know if it's useful to think through.
Yeah, I mean, the whole principle of connectivity and resilience is an interesting one question. Yeah. And we have a question here about, how do you, a lot of the issues that we're dealing with in the Anthropocene, so-called, is the interconnection, the speed and scale of interconnection between us all through, for example, global markets, global communication systems, social media, like we're using now, and how that makes us more interconnected, which creates great opportunities, like we're exploiting here in this book, but also can create vulnerabilities. And so we have this question about the tight connectivity and the vulnerability that creates, and what can we do in order to have a balance in that connectivity and create modularity, which means instead of everything being hyper-connected, so that you can think of if all societies are hyper-connected by mobile people moving between them, then you can imagine something like a disease outbreak would spread very rapidly between those different parts. And in that case, in the scenario of a disease outbreak, you don't want everyone to be hyper-connected. You want to be some sort of modular, some groups who are maybe connected, but not necessarily everybody connected to everybody else.
Yeah.
So the question is, given that we do have these technologies and developments which make us interconnected across the globe and connect ecosystems through greater transport of products and goods, and the spreading of, for example, possible pests, like we've been hearing about the African army moth, which is spreading, or the army moth spreading from Latin America through Africa, threatening crops there. I mean, then we see a really worrying example of connectivity with really worrying negative effects. How do we actually mitigate or live in this interconnected world? How can we manage that and create modularity? So it's a really challenging question, and I think that well, maybe we can reflect on it in terms of each of our cases, but I think in terms of, we're talking about coastal communities in East Africa, which is something I'm familiar with, really trying to understand what happens with that interconnection, for example, with global markets. How does that have an impact? How does that redistribute the opportunities to access and benefit from resource? How does it redistribute the earning capacity? There are different interventions like certification schemes or local governance mechanisms, like coordinated closures of octopus fisheries, which are becoming common in the Western Indian Ocean area where I work, where there's kind of locally derived strategies for how that local system responds in the face of an external market pressure and an external market earning capacity. So in the case of these coordinated octopus closures, they have been very effective in increasing the efficiency with which people are using the octopus resource, because if you have a whole area of the coast in Madagascar, for example, where everybody doesn't fish octopus for a certain period of time, they're very fast growing, and then when they open that fishery, you get a big yield of octopus. And it's actually the global market which has the capacity to absorb all that catch. Local markets would have been flooded with it, so there's a kind of positive connection there. But we also need to be concerned with how global market connections might lead to food products, fish products being sold on the international market, and maybe not going into local, not being available for local consumers in the same way. So having said that, I mean, what we see in Kenya, for example, an emerging trend is that people are actually eating fish that are aquacultured in China. So there's actually fish imports coming into the system. So we see those local interconnections happening in different ways and in kind of complex ways. And it's hard to see how you can interventions can actually prevent that connectivity, but it's whether local governance arrangements can do a good job of managing that connectivity or dealing in an appropriate way.
And I guess a similar example, or quite different actually, in the agricultural context of the Pakistan, which I also speak about in the lectures, is so this is a place that's biologically and culturally very diverse. And one of the things that has happened, I guess, in terms of not managing for diversity or modularity, is that improved seed varieties have been brought in, and then that one variety kind of overconnects the entire system because everything, or the entire landscape, because everything is dependent on certain climatic conditions, for example, and certain market mechanisms or certain market situations in the at the global scale. So what modularity what a modular approach would help do in this situation is that over millennia, communities have kind of specified, so there's kind of intra-communal diversity of different crops, so that throughout the season there's different crops that are sown together, and some will succeed and others might fail. But there will always be something that works. But then also intra-communal, so within the community, but then between the different communities as well, there will be different crops. So one valley might grow fruit, and the next valley might have really good pastoral products, and then the next valley might have more grain products. So that's also an example of modularity within a system that can help lead to more resilient management. Yes. Yeah.
Okay, I have a few questions coming in here.
Okay. Just reading the questions. Yeah, maybe I'll just briefly on this first question about examples of system transformation in industrialized nations. I think that's maybe something that Tim and I have worked less on, but there is an interesting, I think it's a very important and interesting discussion and conversation to be had in terms of distributional effects. There was a paper, for anyone who's interested, by Graham Cumming and colleagues in 2014 in Nature. Don't remember the exact title now, but something about a green and a red trap, where they kind of at a more national level herald Sweden, for example, as being in a green loop or a successful transformation to a sustainable society. Whereas I think, yeah, Beijing, for example, with its air pollution problems, they kind of create a typology of a so-called red trap or an undesirable situation. And while those types of typologies are useful thought exercises, and they definitely are provocative in that sense, I think in terms of system transformation in industrialized nations, there's for sure smaller examples that are taking place all the time. But at a national scale, I think it's also important to think of the distributional effects. So what are the trade, how does Sweden, for example, benefit at a global trade level compared to other nations? So it's not that Sweden in and of itself is a sustainable, successful transformation, even if there are many now sustainable policies in place. That's just a quick comment on that.
And I also think it's really important how things are measured, right? So if you measure impacts on the planet, in some ways Sweden might look quite good, but people consume a lot of, we're sitting in Sweden now, people consume a lot of stuff here, a lot of imported goods, and in a way, by importing the goods, we're able to export our footprint. So depending on how you measure the pollution, the emissions created by that consumption, you can measure it in a very crude way, where Sweden looks like it's got a very clean economy. But if you measure it in a way that you actually see that these products being consumed within Sweden, the embedded pollution that they imply in the countries of production or where those materials have been mined from, you get a much more kind of mixed picture. And I think it is a really critical question because, and I think this is a really important point of seeing the world as an interconnected place, that we talk about sustainability and development, we're really not just talking about what happens in developing countries. I mean, there's a critical and urgent need for system transformation in industrialized countries, and that is interconnected with what's happening in the rest of the world. And I think you see kind of small shifts, but I don't think we see interesting initiatives, such as, for example, transition towns initiatives or small local city level initiatives to kind of try to change different aspects of the system. But my general sense is that we're yet to see kind of large-scale transformation of this kind of scale that we want to be, that we need to be looking at to, maintain the well-being of 9 billion people on the biosphere, looking forward in the long term.
Yeah. And I guess that's why I'm so inspired working with primary communities, for example, because I think nations are also people themselves who've grown up in an industrialized context. It's very difficult to think of truly radical alternative pathways and trajectories. And that's again part of this, what does it mean to be embedded in a place, and what are these intertwined social ecological relationships, and what do they look like, and why do they matter? Well, they matter because it's innovation and ideas and solutions that need to be place-based, which is not to say that they aren't cross-scale in their influence or effect, or with or how they are being affected. But I think, as someone who's worked as a development practitioner, someone who researches within development, I think it's about creating the space for place-based solutions to actually gain voice and traction. And that's what is exciting also about trying to maintain those types of relationships in a given place.
I mean, we've got a question here about the trade-offs between addressing immediate needs and accommodating significant impacts of climate change. But the question is phrased in terms of climate change, but it's really a question about how can these trade-offs between short-term, immediate needs and long-term issues be addressed or be balanced. And I think this is a really key challenge, and we can think of it in the most extreme sense. If you think of a kind of disaster relief kind of context, there has been a lot of thinking and agonizing over the relationship between longer-term development and short-term disaster aid relief efforts, and how, whether in solving an immediate need now, it sows the seeds of a longer-term problem. And how can you deal with immediate, desperate humanitarian situations while still allowing for more sustainable pathways or more sustainable trajectories before? How you, because there is a risk that responding to immediate needs, you solve the immediate problem, but you're cutting down on the future options, the space that you have to help things in the future. So there's an example which is sometimes given if you think about a homeless situation, whether you're kind of giving somebody a space blanket, like a foil blanket to keep themselves warm tonight because they're cold, as opposed to kind of solutions which is going to help that person to find their way into long-term secure accommodation. And I think that this is a real challenge, and it also comes back to this discussion about whether we should be focused on the economic dimension or other dimensions of well-being and poverty, because I mean, money is extremely useful and really important to people. And as I mentioned in my lecture, if you actually, in the various places that I've worked, people are very concerned about having money, because money can buy you food, it can buy you medicine, it is extremely useful, and you can see why that then really is a central lens. The issue is that just by increasing people's income, are you addressing their longer-term concerns? And if you go back and visit communities in the longer term, what's that strategy of development? What's that trajectory of development? How is that actually reducing or increasing people's vulnerability?
To also reflect on there, I think within the development discourse, there is often this idea of resilience as the ability to bounce back, and that it's the ability to bounce back to the status quo. And this whole course is really about trying to move past that. That resilience is actually more about transformation in order to change the fundamental way that we interact with the biosphere, the way that the system operates, in order to make it ultimately more sustainable or better for more people and for the ecosystem in the long term, the biosphere that we all depend on. But often when we read development reports, it's this, trying to drawing this graph, but this short-term bouncing back, whether that's from within a food security context. So that's again just part of this trade-off. Part of that is this adaptation, this quick adaptation that might be necessary, but it's really about longer-term transformation. And it doesn't have to be a trade-off, but in those short-term adaptation scenarios, the longer-term perspective needs to be considered. Otherwise, you might be adapting for the wrong reasons, or as Tim said, reinforcing kind of the dynamics that created a bad situation in the first place, such as homelessness.
I mean, and there was a nice paper in the food security realm by Chris Bennett, sort of really parsing out these different dimensions of resilience in terms of persistence, but also adaptation and transformation, and sort of thinking about, well, what are those capacities that support each of those, and how does that interface with a development policy that's around food security, and being aware that there are these different dimensions and short, longer-term dimensions. So there is that persistent capacity to persist or to bounce back, capacity to adapt, to change, but also the capacity to transform into more sustainable trajectories for the future. And I think the thing is that if you only focus on one of those dimensions and timescales, then in the longer term, we're really just saving up problems. So it is about trying to find that balance. Yeah. We've got a couple of questions specific to our cases.
Yeah.
Is that
right
from your perspective? I can speak to that.
Yeah. Yep. So I'll try to take one here on public trap model being applied in peace and security issues, and how resilient thinking might be able to transform institutions to better face crime and violence. So I can't speak so much specifically to that, but I do think that in the final module of the MOOC, there might be, from the South African cases, a bit more discussion around security issues of some kind, perhaps. But just as a brief reflection on that, I think, yes, in the sense that I think part of what I've tried to do in my research anyway is to think of how a trap can be broadened to think about beyond just the economic, beyond the economic aspects. And one of the ways that traps have also been defined is over connectivity, for example, which often happens in the context of corruption or of very stringent social hierarchies that don't allow for the necessary renewal or to take place. So I think that that's one way, at least, that it's been thought of from an institutional perspective. These types of poverty traps. But again, I think it's not something I have found it useful in a context like Afghanistan, but I haven't specifically tried to tackle the violence issue per se. But I think it's super important and interesting. And there was another question, also more for me, about integrating resilience approaches to bioculture and linguistic knowledge preservation goals. The question is how to integrate resilience approaches. So I think, maybe there's multiple ways to do this. And I think the very premise of social ecological resilience is that the social and ecological are intertwined and can't actually be separated at all. And that's also very much the foundation of a biocultural approach, that biological diversity and cultural diversity co-evolve with each other. So I think in that sense, they're very intuitively linked. And in terms of how to integrate it, again, there would be different approaches, whether it's using the principles and thinking about diversity and redundancy, for example, as particularly important principles within biocultural or linguistic context, or as Maria Tengo also talks a bit about within this module, or last week's module, with the multiple evidence base. Sorry, I think that was a few modules, but anyway, Maria Tengo's work on multiple evidence base, which tries to integrate these many different knowledge systems in a plural way. So that's kind of a lot of different ideas that have emerged from resilience thinking that I think are quite intuitively linked to biological and linguistic diversity. But I think also at its very core, a lot of resilience thinking emerged from kind of a counter movement to the sectoral, or the separation of the sciences, and trying to bring those together, and also acknowledging the importance of traditional ecological knowledge, for example, in managing ecosystems and in being stewards. So stewardship, again, is I guess one of the concepts that we use to try to integrate the importance of I guess place-based, but doesn't necessarily need to be traditional ecological knowledge. Of course, anyone can be a steward, but any type of I'm trying to avoid using the word management, because stewardship is kind of quite different to management, but bringing more of that care, agency, and knowledge that Maria and Johan also talked about into what it means to live on this earth and to prosper, actually. I don't know if that answers that so well. I don't think it, like my goal anyways, isn't to necessarily integrate resilience in biocultural and linguistic knowledge preservation, but I think that they are intuitively quite linked, and if it's useful for any given implementation context or research context, then I think that they can be, and that there's increasingly amount of work on that.
I think one of the key insights around complexity is the uncertainty and the unknowability of these complex systems.
Yeah.
So really, no one knowledge system can really has the kind of monopoly on understanding any particular context or situation. So if the world really did just operate according to a sort of Newtonian physics, a cause and effect, if it was really just like a big machine with levers and cogs, in theory, a scientific, a sort of conventional science approach could really understand, map out that system. There's levers and cogs. You could say, press here, pull that lever, and you'll get this result. And this is the result that we want to come out. And of course, there would also be a need to have debate and accept that there are different perspectives on what result we want. So that's in the first place. But also, the world does not operate as a big machine with cogs and levers. There is always kind of complexity, uncertainty, and different knowledge systems, including different bicultural traditions, and even the way in which systems or ecosystems or nature or humans or Mother Earth is spoken about in different languages. It gives a different emphasis and a different understanding. So I think that the more that we learn about unknowability and complexity, the more that we realize that it's actually really important to have that diversity. And one of the results of connectivity in the modern age has been the loss of linguistic diversity and the loss of multiple perspectives. And that's been one of the trade-offs that we've had with increasing economic development and increasing social development, increasing life expectancy, and all these benefits and all these great wins that we've had during these incredible years of development, all these great things. But one of the things that has been a consistent trend has been that loss of that linguistic and bicultural diversity. We need to think, what are we losing there, and how does that relate to the resilience of the system? If we get too much, everybody, if systems become designed based on a particular perspective on how they think the machine works, then I think we're more likely to make mistakes and lose resilience in the long term.
Yeah.
So we're focusing on optimizing something.
Yeah, and there's definitely a bias also towards the more ecological preservation aspects of it, like the fact that the seeds are preserved, or people acknowledge that this diversity and redundancy of species is important, but the diversity of languages and the knowledge that went to produce those seeds is less well acknowledged. So I think it's something to continue to work on, and hopefully a resilience approach can also help us hold some of those tensions in balance as well.
And now for something completely different. There's been some questions about the Spaceless Data Explorer, and I understand that some of you have been using this tool to explore some of the data that came from some of our field work. And there's some questions about what it is, where it come from, and some of the findings that come from it. So this is really in the research project that we were doing, we were trying to operationalize a multidimensional sense of well-being, and we used we drew from a theory of human needs, which is one particular theory that states that there are some certain universal needs that are required by all humans to be considered to be well. So, you know, if you don't have water, if you don't have access to clean water, you're in significant harm. If you don't have financial security, you're in significant harm. If you don't have shelter, you don't have food, but also if you don't have things like good social relations or some sense of autonomy. These are things that, based on, you know, surveys and work in many different cultures in many different parts of the world, there are these various lists of that different people have come up with and said these are the universal basic needs. And it's a very useful framework because it gives you something very tangible. The key thing is that, okay, we may agree, and the philosophers have kind of argued about exactly what the list is, but there is a general sense that there is a list of maybe 9 or 12 or 15, you know, basic needs that we can say is common to humanity. But the key insight is also that the way in which people meet those needs is very different in different contexts. So we had really a practical problem here. How do we operationalize this theory of human needs in a way that's relevant in the context where we were doing this research in coastal communities of Kenya and East Africa? So we took a multi-step process where we started off with an open focus group discussion, asking open questions about what does it mean to live well within this community? Just what is a good life mean here to you and to people here, and how do you know people who are well, and how do you know people who are in significant harm, who are not meeting their basic needs? And from that, we sort of collected a huge range of different statements from different people, and we used that to sort of validate this theoretically derived theory of human needs. And there was a pretty good matchup between the kind of things that people were saying in this theoretical list of needs. And then we needed to come up with a list of indicators for each of those needs. So education was one of those needs. Okay, can you, so in discussion groups, we asked people from that context, what are indicators of people doing well or doing badly with regards to education? So we had a whole list of indicators from people who were doing really well, the children went to university, people who had no schooling at all, no access to education. And so you had this list of indicators. And then finally we asked, because we really wanted something tangible and measurable. So, and the theory of human needs suggests there's some kind of threshold. Okay, you can be doing very well, you can be doing quite well, but what this really focuses on is when are you in significant harm? So where would you draw the line in all these indicators, from university level education to no school at all? Where would you draw the line where in this community, you know, you're not meeting your basic needs in education? And they discussed and chose what that line was. And this was repeated for all the different human needs that we were able to assess. And then we were able to implement those thresholds in a large scale survey that we were then rolled out amongst a representative sample of the population. So that allowed us to, in quite a tangible, practical way, generate data from a representative sample of the population, which really showed you which basic needs people were missing, in what ways were people deprived, suffering deprivation, and which kind of people were suffering which types of deprivation. And that data was then sort of animated within the Data Explorer. Our different organizations that we were partnering with, the Spaceless project, the representatives from different workshops and collaborative meetings that we had were interested in this data. And what the Data Explorer tool was basically an attempt to, rather than just producing reports or scientific papers, really, and rather than handing over a big database or big spreadsheets of numbers, which actually make our data available to different stakeholders where people could explore themselves according to the different study sites, look at the different basic needs which were missed. So that's one part of the data. The other part of the data is based on focus group discussions, which mapped particular domains of well-being, which basically map onto those basic needs, and what the link is to different ecosystem services. So this was qualitative data from discussions, which was then summarized into basically a particular ecosystem service was or wasn't important, or was very important for a particular basic need. So for example, these were in many cases fishing communities. So the ecosystem service of fish was actually related to not just food and not just income, but also a wide range of different dimensions of domains of well-being. It's important for education because income from fisheries was very important for paying school fees. It was also important for education because kids were able to actually take fish, which was the kind of good food for them, in their pack lunch. They could use that as lunches. So there was a whole huge host of different mechanisms and connections between these multiple different ecosystem services and these different domains of well-being. And so again, the Data Explorer allows you to explore some of those connections between particular basic needs, between particular ecosystem services and particular domains of well-being. And on the first tab of that, you can actually overlay those things. So you can look at, okay, what are types of deprivation, which basic needs are being missed for men and women within particular communities, and then you can also overlay that with, for a particular ecosystem service, which one of these basic needs does this ecosystem service actually contribute to. So that was where the data came from. That was the objective of creating this tool. And I'll just say that we then had a lot of, our team had lots of meetings with different stakeholders, government officers in the county government, people working for different NGOs or development organizations. And yeah, it really was provoking and made people think about multidimensional aspects. And we also have a little tick box there where you can compare fishers and non-fishers, and you can actually explore for yourself the result that I mentioned in the lecture, that fishers are maybe better off in some dimensions, but actually worse off in others. So it's not the case that all these different dimensions of well-being are always correlated, and you have these interesting contrasts, which then triggered interesting thoughts about how different development efforts could help out. So in these communities, it really triggered a lot of discussion about how is income earned and how is income spent, and does it contribute to well-being? And actually, a lot of the partner organizations have sort of moved forward with proposals to try to support savings culture and savings capacity and savings facilities in those communities, so that income earned from fisheries has, instead of being spent in the very short term, is actually more easy for fisher folk to sort of save and invest the income, the higher income that they get from the neighbours, in sort of longer term well-being outcomes for their families, for the community. Another aspect was, I think it was quite striking for some of the stakeholders to really understand the diversity of dimensions of well-being that might come from a particular resource. So in conversations with the forestry department, they have an issue with people who illegally harvest mangroves, and it was really helpful, I think, and striking for them to think about, or to be challenged with the idea that actually, from these meetings with the community themselves, the harvesting of mangrove poles is not just another issue. Somebody's cheating the system and making lots of money about it, but this sample of the community members of these discussions really highlighted how the mangrove poles was contributing to a wide range of different, really important basic needs. Education, food, not just not just income, and not just housing, the practical use of those things.
Yeah. I'm relating now off back of this
Great.
a little bit to a broader reflection that has come in about how can we apply complex adaptive systems perspective in a world of quick, simple fixes.
Good question.
Yeah. But I was just thinking, Tim, reflecting a bit off of what you were saying about the way that you classify these basic needs. That's something that you can take a complex adaptive systems approach, but it doesn't mean that everything is infinitely complex and that there's nothing you can do to intervene or to try to understand the system better. We always end up breaking things down in order to understand them. And then it's also about the reflexivity of what you are or are not capturing. So I think this was one nice example of how can you use some of the principles from a complex adaptive systems perspective to try to get a more nuanced picture of basic human needs, and it also still acknowledging some of those limitations. I think the poverty trap cube example is another example of that. It's a highly simplified version of reality, but in a way we also created that model, and what we hope it could be useful for is to speak a bit to that world of quick, simple fixes. So ultimately, I think we'd all like to change this drive for quick, simple fixes. But given that it is this high-pace reality also, what can we do to bring in aspects of resilience thinking or of a complex adaptive systems thinking perspective to avoid the pitfalls or the dangerous trade-offs that are sometimes made if we're only thinking about the short term. And I think, yeah, from the poverty cube example, it's exactly that. It's saying, it's taking as a base economic model that has existed for decades. It's just saying, hey, look, what if we added 2 other dimensions here? And actually, you get a completely different outcome, which in some instances is quite detrimental, either cultural or biological diversity. So even bringing in, those 2 additional dimensions and acknowledging nonlinearity is enough to maybe say, let's put the brakes on this type of intervention in this type of context. And yeah, it's also not to say that there are blanket solutions at all. Everything will always depend on a given context. I think that would be my attempt to try to answer that a little bit.
It really speaks to this. I think this is a really interesting point because, of course, we can say the world is complicated and everything is connected. But what does that mean that we do? Does that mean we have to add more and more complexity? So your models, presumably you could have added another 20 or 30 axes to that figure. So it really is a challenge of, if you acknowledge there is more complexity and there's more interconnectedness, very simple models, it's okay, how much complexity does it make sense in any given context with any given limited resources to actually incorporate? So we want enough complexity that we avoid the surprises, but if you just add more and more complexity, then everybody would just be overwhelmed with, especially in a world of big data, overwhelmed with information and complexity and too many interconnections and unable to kind of see a way forward. So there's, I guess there's a few aspects of that. One is an idea within complexity that you might have very complex interactions, but then things start to behave in a kind of organized way. It's a sort of organization from complexity. The sort of rule of 5 is the idea that in a complex system, there might be a rule of hands, there might be, actually a limited number of variables that are really controlling this complex system, although there's lots of things going on there. And that can be difficult to discern. But I think the danger is to assume, because in one place this was really a solution, or this was really an important variable to keep track of and to try and change, so we could transplant that to a different context and change it. There may be other things really behind it. So it's really about, the implementation or the use of complexity thinking. It has to be, the challenge is not how do you capture everything in the world, how do you understand all the interactions, because that is ultimately unknowable. It's how do you do experiments or and even thought experiments to try and check which aspects of complexity are really fundamentally important here and do we need to take on board.
Yeah. And I guess as a final reflection on that, like thinking of what role you have in thinking about that complexity. You know, are you a practitioner who works with monitoring and evaluation? How can we make our monitoring and evaluation systems deal with complexity better rather than kind of logical framework analyses, which really promote kind of a shorter term linear thinking style in general? Are you someone who's directly working with farmers, with fisher people in any way? Because often, whether it's local or indigenous knowledge, there's a very embedded and rich picture of complexity that already exists just from observing the world. So how do we give space for those complex perspectives to have voice? Because it's actually often more from a management perspective or from a scientific perspective that we like to reduce the complexity. So I think it's just that reflexivity of what is our role as individuals, as professionals, as researchers within development, and how do we allow, in some ways, complexity? Complexity is there. So taking a complexity perspective is kind of acknowledging that it exists, and rather than trying to manage it away.
I think I'm going to say as my final point, I think in terms of applying a complex adaptive systems perspective, I think a key thing which is often missed is learning. So the importance of learning and the importance of thinking about how our systems of monitoring and reflecting, are they really supporting learning? So if there is quick fixes, how can we address that? Well, if we do sort of put a bit more effort into actually understanding what's going on, evaluating, looking back, learning from what's happened in the past, learning about the system, seeing interventions as experiments, so these sort of ideas of adaptive management. So seeing interventions as an experiment and not then trying to show how that experiment or that implementation has had the effect that we want, really we're missing the real value of that. What is that intervention and what is the way in which things have changed as a result of that intervention? What does that tell us about the system in which we're working in? What does that tell us about the dimensions of complexity that we do or we don't need to take account of? So I think that a key thing that we can take from a complexity approach in terms of implementing it is thinking more seriously about how we're learning, how we're hearing what the system is telling us, and how that through institutions or how that is kind of incorporated into our knowledge going forwards.
Yeah. Well, yeah. Thanks to everyone for participating and for sending in your questions. It's been nice chatting, Tim, trying to reflect a bit on some of these questions. We hope you enjoy the rest of the course.
Good luck.